The baby was 6 months old the first time I thought about stopping. I was sitting in the mudroom before the rest of the house had woken, the only light coming from the small lamp on the shelf by the coat hooks, listening to her fuss and pull and come away hungry. My body was tired in a way I had no language for then, not tired the way you feel after a long day of canning or hauling laundry up from the basement. Something deeper than that. Something that had been accumulating since this birth. Since the one before it, since the early years of my marriage when I first began to understand, slowly and without anyone telling me directly, what it meant to belong to a life that was not entirely my own. I sat in the dark of that mudroom and I thought, I think I am done. And then, before I had spoken a single word of it, before I had told anyone, before the thought had even finished forming itself, fear moved through me. Not fear for the baby, not fear about the milk, fear about what my husband would say, fear about what the community would think, fear about which decisions were mine to make about my own body and which ones were not. My name is Naomi. I grew up in a conservative Old Order Mennonite community in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. I left several years ago, and I am still in the slow, sometimes painful work of learning the names for things that happened to me inside that life. This is a space where I say them out loud, where I try to tell the real version rather than the softened one. If what I share here connects with something in your own story, I would be grateful if you would subscribe and leave a like on this video, and it would mean a great deal to me if you told me in the comments what this brought up for you. Your comments are how I know I am not just speaking into silence. Most people outside a community like the one I grew up in have no idea that something as ordinary as how long a woman nurses her baby can be something she has almost no say in. And most people inside that life would never say it out loud. So I am going to say it. I am going to try to tell you what it actually looked like. In my community, nursing was not a decision a woman arrived at. It was simply the shape of things. There was no written document that said so. Our community had expectations that governed the color permitted on a prayer covering, the appropriate distance between a family and the wider world outside, the length of a man's beard, the pattern of a woman's dress, and none of these needed to be written down because they were carried in the bones of everyone raised inside them. They did not need enforcement because they were prior to the idea of enforcement. You simply knew. You absorbed it the way you absorbed the language. Nursing was like that. It was older than any rule. You nursed because formula was English. Formula was a worldly thing, expensive and unnecessary, and a quiet signal that a woman was prioritizing her own comfort over the provision God had built into her body. You nursed because every woman at every canning frolic and quilting circle and barn raising you had ever attended had nursed. Because your mother had nursed, and her mother before her, and the minister's wife nursed, and the bishop's wife nursed, and none of them had ever, within your hearing, suggested this was something you had a choice about, and you nursed for as long as your husband expected you to. That last sentence is the one that took me years of distance to be able to see clearly. It was not only the community setting the terms, it was the man in your house. In my house, that man was Aaron. I want to be careful about how I describe Aaron because this story is not about making him into something he was not. Aaron was not the kind of man people imagine when they hear a story like this. He did not raise his voice. He was not cruel in any obvious, legible way. He worked hard. He was faithful by every standard our community used to measure faithfulness. What he was, and what took me years and distance and finally therapy to name, was certain. He carried certainty about the world the way he carried certainty about the farm, as if the facts were simply arranged in an obvious order, and any confusion on your part was something temporary that you would work through given time. He had decided, without ever discussing it with me, that each of our children would nurse for a full year at minimum. This was not a conversation we had before our first child was born. It was not a conversation we had in the hospital or in the weeks after. It was simply true, in the way that many things in our marriage were simply true, not announced, not negotiated, just there, discovered only by accidentally walking into their edges. My first child I nursed for 15 months. I was young and my body recovered. I did not question anything because I had nothing to compare it against. I had no framework that would have allowed me to understand that wanting something different was even an option available to me. I thought nothing was wrong. I thought this was simply what it was to be a wife and a mother inside the life I had chosen, or the life that had been prepared for me, depending on how you count it. My second pregnancy was harder. The birth was harder. The recovery was longer in a way that worried me in private, though I did not say so to anyone because saying so felt like a complaint, and complaints were a particular kind of failure. By 5 months postpartum, I was losing weight I could not afford to lose. I was waking twice, sometimes 3 times through the night. I had a toddler underfoot who needed me fully present. I had a farmhouse to run, meals to produce, laundry to manage, floors to keep, a garden in the summer, preserving in the fall, the 1,000 small tasks that made a household, and I had a husband who worked long hours and came home expecting supper on the table, and a wife who was holding herself together. You could be struggling in our world. You could not be visibly struggling. Those were 2 different things. At 7 months, I sat across from Aaron at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and I told him I thought my body needed to stop. I had spent several days composing the sentence in my head, arranging the words, trying to find the right approach. I told him I was losing weight. I told him I was exhausted in a way that sleep was not fixing. I told him I was worried. He looked at me with an expression I would come to recognize as one of his characteristic ones. Patient, unhurried, mildly puzzled, as if I had raised a concern about something that simply worked the way it worked, and my concern did not change that. He said the baby needed at least 5 more months. He said our bodies were built for a full year, and anything less was cutting short what God had designed. I said I did not know if my body had 5 more months to give. He said, "Then you will ask God for what you need." That was the end of it. Not because anything was slammed or raised or threatened, because in our world, when a husband gave an answer, the conversation was over. There was no procedure for reopening it. There was no sentence I had ever been taught to say after that. You had been given your answer. Your answer was, ask God, which meant accept this, which meant find a way from somewhere inside yourself, because the decision has been made. I want to stop here, because I know what is forming in the mind of anyone hearing this from outside our world. The question of why I did not simply stop, why I did not make a different choice. I need you to understand something, and I'm going to try to say it carefully, because I have said a version of this many times and I still do not think I always get it right. The answer is not that I was weak. The answer is not that I lacked courage or nerve or whatever quality you might be reaching for. The answer is that I had been formed from the time I was small to understand that my body's limits were not a medical matter. They were a spiritual one. Discomfort was not a reason to stop anything. Pain was not a reason. These were, in the understanding I had been handed, the very conditions under which faithfulness was demonstrated. Endurance was not acceptable. It was holy. It was what a good woman did, and I had spent my whole life being told that I was a good woman, which meant that telling me to keep going was the same, in the language I had been given, as telling me to keep being who I was. I did not have the word boundary, not in any context that connected it to my own body. I had not encountered the word consent in a way that applied to anything happening inside my own marriage. What I had was the word endurance, and I used it the way you use a roof during heavy rain. The rain was getting in somewhere. Things were getting damaged. But the roof was holding, and the roof felt like enough, and I did not yet know how to wonder what was happening underneath it. I nursed for 5 more months after that conversation, 12 months total for that child. By the end, I was running on something that was not quite will and not quite desperation, but somewhere in between the two, some place I would not recognize for what it was until I was long past it and could finally look back. When I finally stopped, the relief that moved through me was enormous and strange. Not happiness, not joy. Relief, the kind that carries a warning in it, the kind that tells you, if you are quiet enough to hear it, that something you had been calling fine was not actually fine at all. There is a section of this story that sits at the edge of what I am ready to say out loud, not because I am protecting anyone, not because the truth is too large to approach. I have told it in private. I have told it in small rooms. I have told it to the people who needed to hear it. It is simply that there is a difference between knowing something and being ready to send it out into the world, and I am still sitting with that difference. I believe I will find my way to it. I have found my way to things before that I thought I would never be able to say. For now, I want to keep moving through what I can say, because there is still more of it, and it needs to be told. My neighbor Anna stopped nursing her third child at 4 months. Her body had given out in a way that even she could not argue with, even she could not endure through. She told me about it one afternoon while we were working in her garden, speaking quietly with her back angled slightly toward the road, the way women in our community had learned to speak when they were saying something that should not carry, the same way you learn to face toward the sheets on the line when you're hanging laundry. The posture of a woman who has things to say that she cannot afford to be heard saying. She told me her husband had not spoken to her for 4 days when she told him. 4 days in a house where silence was already one of the primary forms of weather. 4 days of meals eaten without eye contact, of questions answered in the fewest possible syllables, of a man making himself a wall that had no door and no window and no opening of any kind. 4 days of someone communicating with absolute precision, without a single word, that you had failed at something you owed him, that your body's limits were a disappointment he was choosing not to dignify with language. She said she had stood in the front room on the evening of the 4th day and told him she was sorry, that she was sorry her body had not been able to give more, that she was sorry for stopping when she did. I asked her what she was sorry for. She was quiet for a long moment. She pulled at something near the base of a tomato plant, not looking at me. Then she said she did not entirely know. She only knew the silence had to end, and she was the only one between the two of them who had anything available to end it with, and the thing available to her was an apology. I have thought about Anna in that garden more times than I could count in all the years since I left. I think about what it means that the only instrument available to her was an apology for something her own body had done without asking her permission. I think about the architecture of a system that does not require rules or written codes or even explicit enforcement, because it has placed the enforcement so completely inside a person that she carries it herself everywhere she goes, guards herself, corrects herself, apologizes for herself, and calls it faithfulness. You do not need a guard at the door if the woman inside has been shaped since childhood to guard it herself. You do not need a law if a person has been taught so thoroughly and so early that it precedes conscious memory, that her own needs are a form of selfishness that requires correction, and that the correction is her responsibility to provide. If you have stayed with this story and something in it is landing somewhere true in you, I would love it if you left me a comment below. You can say as little as you want, even a single word. Knowing someone is on the other side of this, reading or listening, makes it feel worthwhile. And if you are new here, please subscribe. It would mean more than I know how to say properly. By the time my third child was born, I was 25 years old. I had been married for 7 years. I had watched Anna apologize to a well that had run dry. I had nursed 2 children past the point of having anything left to give, and something inside me had gone very quiet in a way that was not peace. It was the quiet of a person who has stopped expecting to be heard, not because they have given up on speaking exactly, More because the act of forming words carefully and sending them towards someone who does not receive them had become more expensive than the silence they were trying to replace. It was a saving of energy, a rerouting of resources toward what could actually be used. My third child I nursed for 3 months. At 3 months, my supply simply stopped. It was not a choice I made in any deliberate sense. It was a fact I arrived at the way you arrive at the end of a road, and the road just ends, and there is nothing past it. I had been supplementing with formula for several weeks by the time I told Aaron. I had made that change without telling him first, not as deception, not as a strategy, not as a conscious act of rebellion, because some part of me had understood in some wordless place below the level of decision that seeking permission this time was not something I was going to do, not because I had become brave, because I had become too exhausted to perform the ritual of asking, because the thing that the ritual cost me had become more than the thing the silence was going to cost me. When I finally told him, more than a week after I had already made the change, his expression did not shift in any dramatic way. What he said was, "You should have come to me when it happened." I said, "I am telling you now." He said, "A wife brings things to her husband when they happen, not after she has already decided." I have turned that sentence over in my hands more times than I can count in all the years since leaving. I've looked at it from every angle, because it contains the entire structure of how our marriage worked more completely and more clearly than anything else Aaron ever said to me. Not my body, not my milk or the absence of it, not my exhaustion or my health, not the 3 months I had spent trying before my supply simply stopped. What mattered was the telling. What mattered was that a decision about my body had been required to travel through him first. That was the procedure. That was what a wife owed. The substance was almost irrelevant. The sequence was everything. I had violated the sequence, and that was the real failure, more legible to him than anything my body had or hadn't done. I did not argue. I said something that moved us away from the edge of the moment. I went to start supper. The house kept running because the house had to keep running, and I was the one keeping it. I left at 27. It was not a single decision made on a single day. It was something that had been building across months, years, a slow accumulation of understanding that the life I was living and the person I actually was had stopped being able to fit inside the same space. And when I finally went, the shunning came the way it always comes in communities like ours, swift, total, and painful in ways I had known to expect and still was not prepared for. People who had known me my whole life did not return my calls. Letters came back unopened. My mother's voice, the one time I managed to reach her, was careful and distant in the way people are careful and distant when they are speaking to someone who has crossed into a place they cannot follow. Not unkind, not cold, careful, managed. The voice of a person protecting themselves from a grief they cannot afford to fully feel. My children were small. The leaving cost everything it was going to cost. I paid it and I kept going because stopping was not an option I had enough left to choose. In therapy, a year or 2 after leaving, I learned the word for what Aaron was doing in those months of quiet management and calm correction. I learned the word for what it means when a person's access to decisions about their own body has to travel through someone else's permission before it becomes real. I learned that the exhaustion I had spent years calling endurance had a different name, and that using the different name did not make me weak for finally saying it. It made me accurate. It made the thing that had happened to me real in a way it had not quite been when I only had the old words for it. I want to say something carefully now, the same thing I gestured toward near the beginning, which is that Aaron was not a monster. He was not a villain in the way a story needs a villain in order to make sense. He was a man who had been raised consistently and completely inside a system that told him his wife's body was a shared resource, that his certainty about her needs was leadership, that her yielding was faithfulness, and that these things together were not control but God's intended order. He believed this the way you believe something that no one in your life has ever given you reason to question. He had never been handed a reason. The system had been very careful about that. If there is a monster in this story, it is not a person. It is the silence. The system that gave women in our community no medical language for their own bodies, no framework for understanding their own limits as legitimate, no permission to name what was too much. The system that placed a woman's suffering inside the category of spiritual growth rather than the category of harm. The system that handed a wife endurance when she needed information, that read her pain as evidence of her faithfulness rather than a signal that someone should be listening. The system where a husband's calm, certainty about a woman's body was called leadership, and a woman's knowledge of her own body was a confusion she needed to pray through. The system where Anna apologizes to a garden for running dry and means every word of it. I was not too young to have 3 children. I was too young to have been told, clearly, plainly, in language I could hold on to, that I was allowed to say, "This is what my body can give, and what lies beyond it is not holiness, it is harm." Those 2 words belong to different categories, and they were never the same thing, even when everything around me was working to make them sound identical. I grieve the woman sitting in the mudroom before dawn, afraid of a thought she had not yet said out loud. I grieve Anna in the garden with her back to the road, speaking quietly toward the tomato plants so no one could read her lips. I grieve every woman who was handed endurance in place of information and told to call it grace, to feel grateful for it, to understand that the carrying of it was itself the gift. I want to say something else, though. Something I mean not as a softening of what came before, but because it is also genuinely true, and I would be leaving something out if I did not say it. The women I grew up with were not broken. They were strong in ways that people outside our community rarely see and often do not know how to recognize. They were skilled and capable and deeply, sincerely faithful in the way people are faithful when faith has been the primary structure of their entire understanding of the world. The community I left was not composed of villains. It was composed of people who had been taught things, the same way I had been taught things, the same way all of us absorb the shape of the world before we are old enough to examine it. The grief I carry when I think about that life is not hatred. It is something more complicated than that, more tangled, more human. I loved people there. Some of them I still love, from across the distance of a shunning, which is its own strange and particular kind of grief. What I want to say at the end of this, and I mean it, I am not saying it because it is the expected ending, is that my body was never a resource to be managed. It was never a debt I owed, never a test being administered, never a field to be worked according to someone else's calendar and someone else's sense of what the harvest required. It was mine. It was mine from the beginning. It was mine in the mudroom before dawn when I was afraid to finish a thought. It was mine on the days I was too exhausted to form words. It was mine in the months I was enduring through something I did not yet have a name for. It was always mine, even in all the years when the silence said otherwise, even when the structure of my entire life was arranged around a different answer. If you are listening to this from inside a life where your body's limits are someone else's decision, I want you to hear that, not as advice, not as a roadmap, because I know the road out of something like that is long and it costs more than anyone on the outside can fully account for. Just as a fact that belongs to you whether or not anyone in your current life has ever said it to you. If you were taught that suffering quietly was the same as trusting God, I see you in that. I was you in that. Your body was not a test. It was not a debt. It was never a field to be managed by someone else's sense of season. It was yours. It is yours. It always was, even when they told you otherwise, even when you believed them. Thank you for being here for this one. If it stayed with you, if it connected with something in your own experience or someone you love, please share it with whoever might need it. Leave me a comment telling me what it brought up. Come back, because there is more to say, and I intend to keep saying it as carefully and as honestly as I can, for as long as it takes.